2020 was a crazy year defined by many things. The COVID pandemic, economic catastrophe, the wildest US election in recent memory, but perhaps what it's best known for were the massive racial justice protests and the brutal police response to them. After the high-profile killing of George Floyd by a Minnesota officer, tens of millions poured out into the streets in outrage as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, only to face a savage state crackdown which led to even more violence. It was nothing short of a reckoning, a radical uprising against a broken status quo that has pushed American racism back to the forefront of the public consciousness, with many of us wondering what must be done to end it once and for all. BLM has pulled all kinds of ideas out of obscurity and into notoriety. From the inconvenient truth about systemic racism to radical demands for police and prison abolition, we saw things no one talked about become all the rage in political discourse. But even as these anti-racist concepts have gone mainstream, they haven't seen the same success with it as white privilege, the theory of societal advantages which benefit whites over non-whites by nature of how they're treated for their skin color. It's super trendy in social justice circles, becoming a key focus of their fight against white supremacy and a core concept of their political theories. We've seen it enthrall liberals, enrage conservatives, and solidify itself as a staple of racial justice activism with next to no signs of dumbing down. Everywhere from public schools to the US Army has been keen on pushing it to new heights, with a renaissance of whiteness studies following its wake. Woke gurus like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi have formed a lucrative industry lecturing progressives about the evils of white supremacy and their role in preserving it, often on behalf of corporations looking to pad out their PR and shield themselves from lawsuits. Privilege politics is becoming inescapable, and if you're white like me, you've sure as hell been lectured about it at one point or another. All of this has triggered the rightist backlash one would expect from any talk that paints their feelings in a bad light, with some going as far as to call it outright genocidal, which in turn causes its proponents to double down on them as proof of white fragility. This makes critiquing privileged discourse frustratingly difficult from a progressive perspective, which is a huge shame, as it misrepresents racial oppression and makes organizing against it considerably harder. In its conventional form, this view of privilege drives attention away from the marginalized, has terrible characterization, is rooted in postmodern idealism, and offers an idea of praxis that's vapid and ineffective. If we want to end white supremacy for good, we should reconsider the theories surrounding it that could be holding us back and think up alternatives better suited to fight it. That's the goal of this video. I'll be taking a close look at this strain of id poll and if it follows through in its own stated goals. I know I'm a bit late to the party here, but privilege talk is here to stay and deserves a closer look to see if it's what it's cut out to be. If you want to see more of this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so you never miss an upload. With all that said, let's dive straight in and lay out the problem with privilege politics. Before we kick things off here, I should mention that I'm not entirely opposed to the concept of racial privilege. White people do hold some advantage by nature of not having to deal with the racism that others go through, having received preferential treatment for all of US history. Instead, I'm opposed to what I define as privilege politics, the framework that turns this bread and butter concept into the central paradigm of an all-encompassing worldview. As stated earlier, I'm white myself, but most of the views laid out here have come from my discussions with black radicals on the topic. They, unlike the big names in social justice activism, are consistently critical of the concept of white privilege and how it's been proliferated by the activist movement. In the study of racial privilege and the broader field of whiteness studies established in the United States, activists and academics alike use the concept to examine how racism affects the lives of white and white-passing people. With roots in early critical race theory, the term gained popularity through feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh's foundational essay titled White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which described the benefits that whites receive and non-whites don't as a quote, invisible package of unearned assets. White privilege involves obvious and obscure advantages that white people may not recognize, distinguishing it from the overt prejudice racism is usually seen as. These include affirmations of one's worth, higher social status, and greater freedom to move, buy, work, play, and speak that non-whites may not receive. The effects are seen in a wide array of contexts, from the professional to the personal. The idea of white privilege also implies the right to assume the totality of one's experiences, marking the status of others as exceptional with whiteness perceived as the default. Other types of privilege are also discussed, from being male, straight, cisgender, or even thin. Each draws a line between an oppressed group and an oppressor, with these connected forms of privilege and power overlapping to form unique experiences in a theory called intersectionality. A black woman has to deal with misogyny and anti-black racism, while a white man has the boon of being white and male. This model is pretty basic and bland, ignoring the primary contradiction of class in favor of different identity groups. So building a universal framework around it is questionable since it often confuses more than it explains. All this merges into a race-centric worldview that places blame for white supremacy on the implicit bias and attitudes of white people, leading to some activists pushing bold claims about how all white people are racist by nature of holding it. They claim that since whites benefit from the privilege built by racism, every single one of them is racist for holding it. While the validity of this is highly controversial, it is nonetheless caught on to an influential degree. If the oppression of Black Americans is the fault of white bias, then the solution is for whites to put in the work of overcoming it. Perhaps this is best exemplified by the callous catchphrase of "check your privilege," that's memed to oblivion to mock progressives but is still very much reflective of how many of them think. It's for all intents and purposes a self-help approach to fighting racism, a struggle with one's inner demons and original sin. Right off the bat, it's quite easy to draw parallels between all this and the idea that climate change is primarily driven by the individual choices of consumers. For as long as we've known about the problem, major corporations have pushed propaganda designed to make the fight against climate change about personal choices rather than their own business practices. A study found that Exxon and its owners spent billions on deceptive PR campaigns made to make the public think that we have to consume our way out of this mess. Through metrics such as the personal carbon footprint created by BP, we are told that the best way to save the planet is for all of us to stop eating bacon and buy a Tesla. Privilege politics does much of the same. It takes a collective problem and claims it must be solved through individual means. The idea is that not only do white people universally benefit from white supremacy, but that we are responsible for maintaining it due to our attitudes. We've internalized our prejudice past the point of no return, and nothing will change without a massive reckoning. This reckoning, as one would expect, is an entirely personal one, ideally coupled with supplementary reading material and overpriced seminars. Instead of capitalism and colonialism being the driving forces behind racist oppression, it's caused by implicit bias and negative attitudes. By distracting us from the institutions which maintain white supremacy, acting as if the material privilege they produce is the cause rather than a symptom, it atomizes it to a character fault akin to how conservatives view poverty. It is, for all intents and purposes, woke bootstrapping. This atomization of racism is by design. By viewing problems as stemming from individuals, it drives focus away from the systems that are more likely than not causing them. Progressive capitalists embrace this strategy because it sticks to the approved channels. This hampers solidarity and neuters movements fighting for change by limiting their praxis to voting in Democrats and attending conferences. Changing hearts and minds can only get you so far, which is exactly what the ruling class wants. Kwame Ture outlined the problem with this approach decades ago when he said, quote, "If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is not a question of attitude, it is a question of power." Liberals are keen on pushing attitude and privilege as the end-all do-all because racism gets its power from capitalism, and they don't want people to start opposing capitalism. Recent evidence suggests that viewing everything through the lens of privilege doesn't make us more empathetic. In fact, it can make us even less so. According to a research paper published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, educating liberals about white privilege makes them more likely to view poor whites negatively than to sympathize with poor blacks. It didn't significantly change their sympathy for a poor black person, but it did significantly reduce their sympathy for a poor white person. That shows that all this is, in effect, a complete waste of time. I wouldn't be surprised if bourgeois anti-racists have no intention of actually ending racism because if we did, they'd be out of a job. Some of these activists make millions educating people about it in a way that's horribly counterproductive. Anyone who does deeply care about this should see that that isn't the right way forward. It's true that our actions and apathy towards injustice are big factors in both the crisis of climate and crisis of racism, and that we all have an important role to play in combating both. But even if every white person adopts the views pushed by Robin DiAngelo, it wouldn't do anything unless we abolish the institutions that keep people marginalized. Just as reducing our personal carbon footprint is worthless until we fight for revolutionary change to prevent Armageddon. Another problematic aspect of privilege politics is how it's framed. In Penny McIntosh's foundational essay, she lists various examples of advantages white people enjoy over non-white people of similar socioeconomic status, such as being less likely to be singled out by cops or being able to shop alone without being treated with suspicion. Some of the examples she listed are downright silly, such as the ability to enter a record store and find music of your race represented as if black rap artists aren't the top dogs in the industry. But this work is the basis for how much of academia and society views privilege. The clear but inconsistent edge whites hold over non-whites is continually framed as an invisible package of unearned assets, as if not getting shot by law enforcement is something you have to earn. Black anarchist Idris Robinson outlined the problems with this approach perfectly and how it should be done, where he said, quote, "By avoiding the morbid libidinal core of white supremacy, identity politics, intersectionality, and social privilege discourse comprise the most sophisticated sector of this police apparatus. If you look at, for instance, Peggy McIntosh's definitive text on white privilege, she talks about the privilege of being able to chew with your mouth closed. I don't give a fuck about chewing with my mouth closed. This is where the main takeaway from this lies. To me, white privilege is the privilege of not being subjected to the same racist treatment that people of color experience. That seems less like a privilege and more like a right that should belong to every human being. We shouldn't see it as an unmerited advantage white people are individually obliged to criticize themselves over. We should see freedom from racism as a goal to be strived towards by and for all. Individual solutions to systemic problems have never worked and never will. Fighting racism by telling white people to check their privilege is like fighting poverty by telling poor people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Privileged discourse shifts attention away from the marginalized and the systems that keep them chained towards individual character faults. We shouldn't feel guilt over racism. We should feel rage and channel that towards righteous action against the system causing this mess in the first place. Promoting rhetoric that centers the downtrodden while acknowledging that oppression comes from systems rather than mere character faults is key. A bootstraps approach to social justice can only get you so far, so our focus shouldn't be pushing privilege, it should be fighting power. My name is Cascaden, and I will see you in the next video.